You've been told that taking notes is essential. Every teacher, every study hack blog, every productivity guru repeats it. Write it down or you'll forget. So you write, you highlight, you fill notebook after notebook. But here's the punch to your confidence. Most of those notes are worthless. Imagine you're watching a movie, but instead of paying attention, you're busy transcribing every line of dialogue. At the end, you have a script, but you have no idea what the film was about. That's what most note-taking does to your learning. It gives you the comforting illusion of progress while your brain is stuck in neutral. You know the frustration. You review your notes before an exam and realize none of it sticks. You recognize phrases but can't explain the ideas. Your mind goes blank when asked to teach it to someone else. Why? Because you weren't learning. You were copying. Here's the real pain. Years go by, and you keep repeating this cycle. You think, I'm just not smart enough, or worse, I need to try harder. But the truth is, you've been handed a broken tool and told to build a skyscraper. Feynman called this bookkeeping, doing the paperwork but never running the business. We mistake the act of writing for the act of understanding. Our brains crave shortcuts, so we grab the pen and zone out, tricked by the ritual. It's like painting a car and calling it an engine overhaul. Looks shiny, but won't take you anywhere. But here's the part nobody tells you. The more notes you take, the more you outsource your memory. You build a library of pages, but your mind becomes a storage closet, crammed, cluttered, impossible to navigate. When you need an idea, you dig through piles of disconnected facts. The knowledge isn't in you, it's scattered around you. And here's the kicker, science backs this up. Studies in cognitive psychology show that passive note-taking activates the shallowest processing in your brain. You remember surface, not substance. It's activity without insight, a hamster wheel masquerading as progress. The act feels productive, but it's a distraction from real understanding. But here's the first crack in the myth. If you want to join the minority who study to understand, not just to pass, subscribe now. Because the next step is to see how Feynman flipped this entire paradigm. Feynman looked at knowledge the way a mechanic looks at an engine. He wanted to see the gears move, not just memorize the parts' names. Imagine him in his cluttered Caltech office, chalk in hand, refusing to take notes during a lecture. Not out of arrogance, but because he believed notes became a crutch. If you can only follow an idea by looking at your scribbles, you don't own the idea, you're renting it. He once said, "You must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool." He watched peers fill pages with copied equations, convinced they understood, when in truth they were spectators, not players. Feynman saw this as the intellectual equivalent of tracing a map instead of learning the terrain. He'd rather get lost, stumble, and discover the path himself, because that's where real understanding lives. Here's a visual. Picture two students in a physics class. One is hunched over, transcribing every word, eyes glued to the page. The other is listening, pausing, wrestling with the ideas in real time. The first student leaves with a thick notebook, the second with a mind full of questions and a few hard-won answers. Which one is actually learning? Feynman would bet on the second every time. Now, imagine you're building a bridge. If you only draw the blueprints but never touch the materials, you can't know if the structure holds. Feynman's approach was to build, break, and rebuild ideas in his mind until they stood on their own. Notes weren't forbidden. He used them as scratch paper, not as storage. The real learning happened in the mental construction, the struggle, the act of making sense without a script. He tested this in practice. During his time in Brazil, he noticed students could recite Maxwell's equations but couldn't explain why a mirror flips left and right but not up and down. The disconnect? They were fluent in symbols, illiterate in meaning. Feynman didn't care how much you wrote. He cared whether you could play with the concept, bend it, and still make sense. He wanted you to be able to explain it to a child, to strip away jargon and see if the core idea survived. This is the Feynman lens, learning as active exploration, not passive transcription. If your knowledge can't survive outside your notes, you don't know it. You're just acting out the motions, like a musician who memorizes finger positions but never hears the melody. Feynman's genius wasn't in how much he remembered, but in how deeply he understood. He could take apart any concept, turn it inside out, and rebuild it from scratch, because he never let notes become a substitute for thinking. But here's the error everyone makes next. They confuse writing with thinking. Feynman called it intellectual laziness disguised as diligence. The next block will show why your brain can't truly learn by copying, and what's happening in your neurons when you do. Imagine you're tracing a complex circuit with a pencil, eyes fixed on the wires but never connecting them. That's what your neurons do when you copy notes instead of truly processing them. Neuroscience shows mere repetition and transcription barely activate the neural networks responsible for deep understanding. When you just write what you hear or see, it's like shining a flashlight on the surface of an ocean. You see the ripples, never the depths. The hippocampus, the brain's center for memory formation, barely flickers. Synapses fire weakly, like a muscle flexed without resistance. Here's the catch. Learning isn't storage, it's rewiring. When you actively grapple with ideas, ask, predict, explain, the prefrontal cortex lights up. It cross-examines, it forges new links. But passive note-taking, it's background noise to your brain. The information enters as static, never decoded, never integrated with what you already know. This is why, after hours of copying, you look at your notes and feel a blankness. You recognize the words, but can't reconstruct the logic. Feynman despised this. He saw too many students treating notebooks like external hard drives, not thinking machines. He wanted your mind to be the laboratory, not the shelf. Let's break this down further. When you simply transcribe, your brain is in what neuroscientists call the default mode network, a state of low engagement, almost autopilot. The real magic happens in the executive network, where your brain is forced to make decisions, resolve contradictions, and build mental models. Copying bypasses this. It's like watching someone else lift weights and expecting your muscles to grow. But here's the error everyone makes next. They confuse the comfort of familiarity with mastery. Your brain loves patterns. When you see the same phrases you wrote down, you feel a false sense of competence. But recognition is not recall. It's the difference between seeing a map and being able to navigate the terrain blindfolded. Feynman called this the illusion of knowledge, the most dangerous trap in learning. So why do we default to passive notes? It feels productive. It's visible effort. But your neurons know better. They crave struggle, not repetition. They're sculpted by effort, not exposure. The brain's plasticity, the ability to rewire and strengthen connections, depends on active engagement. That means making mistakes, correcting them, and wrestling with confusion until clarity emerges. Feynman called this the difference between knowing the name of a thing and knowing the thing itself. Biology agrees. Only when your brain is forced to organize, synthesize, and explain does real learning happen. Copying is easy. Understanding is violent, neurally speaking. It's the friction, the cognitive dissonance that forges lasting knowledge. Now, let's see how to break this cycle. How do you turn note-taking into a weapon for real learning, not a pacifier for your conscience? Picture your brain as a cluttered garage. Traditional note-taking is like labeling all the boxes without ever opening them. You feel organized, but if you need a tool, you have no idea where it actually is, or even what it does. Feynman saw this as the fatal flaw in most learning, substituting the act of naming things for the act of understanding them. The label becomes a mask, hiding your ignorance. This isn't just semantics. Neurologically, naming activates surface associations, quick links, shallow recollection. True understanding forms deeper synaptic networks. It's the difference between memorizing the word photosynthesis and being able to explain, using only basics, how a plant transforms sunlight into energy. One is a sticky note, the other is a working machine in your mind. Here's the trap. Schools reward you for naming. Exams test your ability to regurgitate. So you fill notebooks with definitions, formulas, and summaries. You finish with pages of labeled boxes. But when you're asked to solve a real problem, you're lost. The boxes are empty. Feynman called this cargo cult learning, mimicking the appearance of knowledge without the substance. He refused to write things down unless he could explain them simply, without referencing notes. If he couldn't, he knew he didn't understand. This was his litmus test, brutally honest and embarrassingly effective. The principle is clear. Only what you can reconstruct, explain, or use without aid is truly learned. Passive note-taking tricks you into feeling progress, but it's mental treadmilling. You need friction. You need to wrestle with ideas. That's when the brain rewires itself. Imagine a mechanic who reads manuals and writes down every part number, but never assembles an engine. When the time comes to fix a car, he's paralyzed. The real skill isn't in the list, it's in the assembly. Learning works the same way. So next time your pen moves faster than your mind, stop. Ask, am I naming or understanding? That simple question can change the trajectory of your learning forever. But here's a dangerous misconception. Many believe that just by switching to active strategies, the problem is solved. There's a hidden obstacle almost everyone overlooks. The ego loves shortcuts. The mind craves comfort. And that's where the real battle begins. Your brain is a master illusionist. It convinces you that scribbling notes, highlighting, or rephrasing a paragraph equals deep understanding. It feels productive. But it's like sketching the outside of a house and claiming you've explored every room. You see the facade, but you have no idea what's inside. Here's the trap. You read something, jot it down, and your mind whispers, "Good job, you've done enough." That's comfort masquerading as competence. Feynman saw this everywhere, students mistaking familiarity with comprehension. They clung to notebooks, reciting definitions, but couldn't answer why or how does this connect. They could repeat the words, but the meaning slipped through their fingers. Imagine you're watching someone juggle. You can describe the pattern, the color of the balls, the smoothness of their movements. But if you've never thrown the balls yourself, you know nothing about juggling. That's passive note-taking, observing the performance, never attempting the act. You're a spectator, not a participant. So why do you fall for this? Because struggle feels wrong. Because blank pages are scary. Active engagement, forcing yourself to reconstruct ideas from scratch, feels inefficient, even embarrassing. The ego hates to look ignorant, even to yourself. The mind prefers the comfort of copying over the discomfort of confronting what you don't know. But here's the Feynman epiphany. If you never risk error, you never risk real learning. Growth is ugly. It's wrestling with confusion, not hiding behind neat notes. The urge to stay comfortable is your biggest enemy. You want the illusion of progress, not the discomfort of gaps exposed. You want to feel smart, not to become smart. This is the invisible trap, mistaking the act of writing for the act of thinking. You can fill pages and still have an empty mind. The brain rewards you with a hit of satisfaction for every completed note, every highlighted sentence. But those rewards are counterfeit. They don't build understanding. They build the habit of avoiding real effort. So how do you escape? By intentionally courting discomfort. Close the book. Try explaining the concept aloud, as if teaching a child. Stumble. Hit the wall. Notice where your sentences collapse. That's where learning starts. Write what you can't explain, not what you already know. This is how you force the mind out of autopilot. You turn from a scribe into a scientist, from a recorder into a thinker. Feynman called this the pleasure of finding things out, but the pleasure only comes after the pain of not knowing. Every time you feel lost, every time your notes run dry, that's your invitation. The obstacle isn't the difficulty of the subject. It's your desire to stay comfortable with half-knowledge. The real test is not how much you can write, but how much you can explain without looking at your notes. Here's the real active strategy. Seek out confusion. Hunt for your blind spots. If your brain protests, you're in the right place. The discomfort is the signal. When you stop running from it, you start learning for real. That's the shift Feynman made, and the one you need to make if you want to escape the invisible trap. But here's the mistake almost everyone makes. Your mind isn't just confused, it's defensive. The real obstacle isn't lack of information, but the silent resistance of your own ego. Your brain wants to preserve the illusion that you already know enough. It hates being exposed. Picture a fortress with thick walls. Every time you encounter something you don't understand, your ego slams the gate shut. You skim, you copy, you highlight, anything to avoid admitting you're lost. The act of taking notes becomes a shield, not a tool. You're not writing to understand, you're writing to prove you were present. Feynman saw this all the time at Princeton. Brilliant students, expert at filling notebooks, terrified of looking foolish. They clung to terms and formulas as badges of competence, but when pressed, explain it so a first year can follow, the facade crumbled. This is the trap. The more you rely on passive notes, the more you reinforce the wall. You confuse activity with mastery. The brain rewards you with a false sense of progress. Look how much I wrote. But depth requires risk, being willing to look stupid, to say, I don't get it yet. Why does this happen? Biologically, your brain is wired to avoid dissonance. It craves certainty. When you challenge yourself, you trigger discomfort, an ancient alarm that says retreat to safety. But in learning, safety is stagnation. Feynman called this the not knowing disease. The cure? Intellectual humility. You must want truth more than comfort. You have to interrogate your knowledge until it confesses its gaps. But here's the deeper twist. Even when you know you should embrace confusion, your mind invents clever tricks to avoid it. You might rephrase a concept in your own words, but only superficially. You might nod along, convincing yourself you've understood when you've only memorized the outline. The ego is a master of disguise. It prefers the appearance of understanding to the real thing because real understanding is vulnerable. It means facing the possibility that your foundation is shaky. This is why most people plateau. They build a castle of notes, but the foundation is sand. When the test comes, whether it's an exam, a real-world problem, or a simple question from a curious child, the whole structure collapses. Feynman's genius wasn't just in his intellect, but in his willingness to bulldoze his own castles. He'd say, I don't know, and start from scratch. That's how he built knowledge that could withstand any storm. So, next time you're tempted to just write what you hear, pause. Ask, am I building understanding or just stacking words? The real work starts when you drop the armor and let the confusion in. This is the cost of transformation, sacrificing your pride for the possibility of real growth. If you want to learn like Feynman, you have to be braver than your ego. Now zoom out. This isn't just about how you study for exams. Feynman's approach is a blueprint for how to confront any challenge that demands true understanding. Imagine you're trying to fix a broken radio. Most people grab the manual and follow the steps. Feynman would take the radio apart, poke at the circuits, and ask, what does this part really do? He didn't settle for the manual says so. He wanted to see the invisible logic connecting every wire, every component, every cause and effect. That's the leap you need to make. Passive note-taking is just reading the manual. Active engagement, questioning, explaining, building mental models is like taking the radio apart and rebuilding it in your mind. This method turns you from a note-copying machine into an investigator of reality. Suddenly, you stop just memorizing facts for the next test. You start organizing knowledge so it fits together piece by piece, like the gears in a clock. Each concept interlocks, each fact finds its place, and the whole mechanism starts to make sense. But here's the twist. This way of thinking bleeds into everything. When you approach problems at work, you stop parroting company protocols. You start asking, why does this process exist? What's the principle behind it? When you meet a new idea, you don't just accept it, you dissect it, you challenge it, you make it your own. You stop being a passive consumer of information and become an active creator of understanding. Feynman called this the pleasure of finding things out. It's a mindset that transforms frustration into curiosity and fear of failure into hunger for clarity. This is how breakthroughs happen. Not by copying what's in the book or on the slides, but by tearing apart assumptions and reconstructing your own map of the territory. When you do this, you're not just learning, you're inventing your own understanding, tailored to your brain, your questions, your life. Think about how this applies outside the classroom. When you're faced with a new technology, do you just follow the instructions, or do you ask, what's really going on under the hood? When you hear a political argument, do you just repeat the talking points, or do you break it down, test the logic, and see if it holds up? When you're learning a new skill, do you mimic the motions, or do you ask, why does this work? What's the underlying mechanism? This is the Feynman way, refusing to be satisfied with surface-level answers. It's about building a habit of relentless inquiry, of not letting your brain settle for easy explanations. It's about seeing every problem as a system to be understood, not a script to be memorized. And the more you do this, the more you realize that every field, science, business, relationships, even your own habits, runs on principles waiting to be uncovered. Bottom line, when you stop taking notes as a crutch, you give your brain permission to wrestle with ideas. At first, it's hard, it feels exposed, but it's the only way to upgrade your mind for every arena. Science, business, relationships. That's how Feynman thought. You can too. The world doesn't reward people who copy notes. It rewards those who see the hidden gears, who build their own understanding from the ground up. That's the shift. That's the mind shift. Here's your new default. Every time you learn, picture yourself not as a scribe, but as an engineer. Don't just copy blueprints. Build the machine in your mind. If you get stuck, it's not a failure, it's a signal. Time to examine the gears, not just admire the casing. That's the Feynman way. He didn't care about memorizing the textbook. He wanted to see if the engine actually ran. Visualize this. You're in a workshop, surrounded by loose parts, wires, levers, cogs. Most people just label them and walk away. But you, now, grab a wrench. You try assembling, connecting, testing. Sometimes the engine sputters, sometimes it roars. That's how learning works. Assembly, breakdown, rebuild. The true test is never, did you write it down? It's, can you build it from scratch when the paper's gone? This isn't just about science, it's about every challenge. Relationships, careers, life decisions. They're all complex systems. You can't navigate them by reciting someone else's instructions. You have to understand the mechanism. That's where the mind shift pays off. But here's the error everyone makes. They confuse possession with mastery. Owning a manual isn't the same as knowing how to drive. Copying notes isn't the same as understanding. Feynman called this the difference between knowing the name of something and knowing the thing itself. If you want to be in the minority who truly understand, you have to get your hands dirty. You have to break things apart, see how they fit, and rebuild them in your own words. So what does this look like in your daily life? Next time you're tempted to transcribe a lecture word for word, stop. Ask yourself, could I teach this to a child? Could I explain it without looking? If not, you haven't built the machine yet. The discomfort you feel isn't a sign of stupidity. It's the friction of real thinking, the kind that forges new neural pathways, not just temporary imprints. Here's your invitation. Become the builder, not the librarian. Sharpen your curiosity. Question your own explanations. If your mind feels friction, push deeper. That's where insight lives. Every time you resist the urge to copy and instead reconstruct, you're rewiring your brain for independence. You're preparing yourself for a world that rewards clarity, not regurgitation. If this video spun a new gear in your mind, the next one will set the whole engine in motion. Subscribe for the next mind shift.